Hiya Toonsters, today I'm going to be talking about the evolution of the Animaniacs. There are many contradictory origins for the Animaniacs given within the literature of the cartoon. The Warners specifically are always explained to have originated in the 30s and been too wacky to be contained, so they had to be locked into the Warner Brothers Tower, where they are finally released and we get to enjoy the run of the show, Animaniacs. The Animaniacs really do have deep origins in the 1930s and beyond, and we're going to explore that in this video right now. But first, I just want to give you some context to how important the Animaniacs were for me. I grew up loving Looney Tunes, and Tiny Toons had probably the biggest impression on me, but in 1994 I moved to a different province in Canada. I moved to Toronto. It was a big city. It was a really big move for me, and I went to a very different school. It was an all-Jewish school, whereas previously I had come from a province where virtually everyone is culturally Christian, if not a practicing Christian in background. So it was a really different environment for me to be immersed in. I didn't find students were immediately accepting of me as a friend, and one of the tools I found that really helped me break in and make friends was humor. I found that the humor I experienced in this school was often different than that of what I was used to. A small example of that was where I come from, Simpsons was immediately thought by almost everyone unanimously as the funniest show on TV. It was quoted and referenced ad nauseum. But when I got to this all-Jewish school, they didn't have such a good reception to The Simpsons. They certainly loved it and thought it was super funny, but Simpsons is also something from a culturally Christian background. So I think that for that reason, and some other reasons, these kids responded more to the Looney Tunes cartoons, particularly the Animaniacs. Animaniacs was new that year. I was really heartbroken to have Tiny Toons go off the air, but I was thankful to have it at least replaced with something, the Animaniacs, which were a continuation of that youthful, joyful expression of lunacy and childishness. And the kids of this school loved that, and it really helped me break through to just relate mainly about that show to Animaniacs with them. Like, was one of the main things I found when I first got to that school, that, you know, just quoting lines from that and showing that I thought that that was funny helped me break in with a few groups of friends, which isn't unnatural for any group. You know, humor is always a good way to make friends and to meet people and stuff, but I just found a really big distinction from the environment I'd been in before and this environment. And it wasn't a big problem for me to celebrate Looney Tunes and Animaniacs and get into that with these kids, because I love those tunes, and that was ultimately a good experience for me. So let's get into the history of the Animaniacs. I more so want to talk about the origin of the Animaniacs through the literature of Looney Tunes. But before I start, I just want to give a brief history of that. Animaniacs was a show that was developed after Tiny Toons, and Spielberg and Paul Rugger and other people had definitely been collaborating on that. I know Spielberg had pitched a kind of a Plucky Duck spin-off series. Some concept art was developed featuring like a family of ducks, green ducks like Plucky, and there were so many ducks in popular media at that time, including video games, toys, television, and Disney cartoons and stuff like that. So they decided to go with another distinctive feel. And ultimately they settled on this look and on the Warners, and you can see some early concept art of that. But where does this look come from, and how did they get that aesthetic in the first place? I know they're not really definitive animals, and the animals have been classed scientifically as cartoonist characteristics. So let's have a deep look at the Warners and the rest of the Animaniacs and where they come from. One of the earliest Warner Brothers characters is an animal creature, kind of like the Warners, by the name of Bosco. Bosco and his girlfriend Honey are some of the most classic and old Warner Brothers characters. Originally they looked kind of like monkeys, but they still had a really distinctive appearance that was similar to the Warners. The original artist who created Bosco left the production company of Warner Brothers to do some other animated productions with the same character that didn't quite pan out. So when we see Bosco later down the road in Warner Brothers productions, they give him and Honey a little redesign. While the classic Bosco and Honey do remind us of the Warners in style and appearance, you can really see the inspiration when you see the redesign of their image in the Tiny Toons episode called Fields of Honey. This is a super heartwarming episode of Tiny Toons where Babs Bunny is turned off that all the classic Looney Tunes are men, with the exception of Bugs, of course.
You are not an ugly woman.
She's looking for a distinctive female role model to look up to, and she goes to the Warner Movies vault and finds some cartoons with honey in it and really responds to her character, which is a really sweet cartoon, and I definitely recommend checking out that Tiny Toons episode. But it's in that episode where we see Bosco and Honey redesigned, and their appearance looks so much more like the Warners. Like, I just really thought that Bosco reminded me of a proto version of Yakko in that episode, and I was convinced when I saw that episode that all the Animaniacs were the rebirth of these classic 30s characters. One example of that would be the classic sassy rich Hippo Girl character from the 1930s. She's seen in all the Foxy and Roxy cartoons, and that's still my favorite version of her. I love in One More Time when she just won't pull over her Rolls Royce for Foxy, who is the police officer, and she gives him like a little sassy finger snap. But you can see this character all through Warner Brothers history, including in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So I was really excited to see the character given new life in Animaniacs, where she has a husband, and it's like a more developed character, and she gets to do more dialogue and stuff. Having said that, I still love her appearance in the 30s cartoons. Those are still my favorite showings of her. But that is an example of a classic 30s character who has been given new life in the Animaniacs. And a lot of the Animaniacs, not just the Warner Brothers and the Warner sister, are re-showings of old classic 30s tunes. With the exception of some of the really cool unique ones, like, you know, Minerva Mink and Rita and Runt, but I could really see how it was like this whole cast of 30s characters coming to life again. And unlike Tiny Toons, which is like a sitcom that takes place all at the Looniversity, that does have some skits but is more based on a core group of characters who interact in the same way, Animaniacs is like a throwback to that 30s style of 8-minute shorts that are totally wacky and different and don't really have any literary continuity to them at all, except for, you know, in that Pinky and the Brain are always trying to take over the world, and Yakko and Wacko and Dot will always respond in the same way to certain stimulus, but they could be Sherlock Holmes in one skit, and they could be in outer space in the next one. The Warners are thought to be composites of the Marx Brothers, Lucille Ball, and various Warner Brothers cartoon characters. Having said that, they definitely have their more intense inspiration in these classic tunes. And if you're not satisfied with the similarities I'm drawing from Honey and Bosco, then you have got to check out the characters Foxy and Roxy. From the 1931 cartoons Smile Darn Ya Smile, Lady Play Your Mandolin, and One More Time. These characters look almost identical to Mickey Mouse in the classic versions, except for they have distinctive fox ears and fluffy tail, and I just love these characters. Foxy and Roxy are some of my all-time favorites, and I love Smile Darn Ya Smile. These are very influential cartoons that had a huge impact on the Tooniverse, and for an example of that, you can look to Who Framed Roger Rabbit. When you go into Toontown, the Toons all sing Smile Darn Ya Smile as kind of a Toontown theme, and at the end of the movie, they all come together and sing it, which is an awesome moment where you can see Bugs and Mickey and even Woody Woodpecker and all these interesting tunes here together finally at last. Except for we don't, of course, see Foxy and Roxy, and I think that's because of their intense similarity to Mickey Mouse. Now, I didn't draw that much comparison between them and the Warners until my mind was blown after rewatching another classic Looney Tunes episode called Two-Tone Town. Two-Tone Town is an awesome episode of Tiny Toons. I highly recommend checking it out, especially if you want to have a really good picture of how the Warners were conceived. At the top of the episode, Buster is worried about his career and the future of the show Tiny Toon Adventures. But then Babs persuades him to go to a movie on another part of town, which winds up being Two-Tone Town, a black and white area of Acme Acres where the tunes of the 1930s live on. So cool. The guy who sells them the tickets at the movie theater just happens to be Foxy. So there we're reintroduced to some familiar characters, Roxy, Big B, and Goopy Gears, who is the dog piano player. But they have a redesign, and they look even more familiar to me now. They look like the Warners. after the movie, Babs and Buster get to meet the two-tone tunes, Foxy, Roxy, Goopy Gear, and Big B, but they're out of work. Babs vows that she's gonna find them work and make them stars again, and they prepare for an audition for an upcoming Warner Brothers movie. With a little help from Buster and Babs, they impress the Warner Brothers movie executives, who actually proclaim that they're funnier than Tiny Toon, and they give them the Tiny Toon Adventures TV slot on television. Buster and Babs are of course devastated and wind up on Tooniewood Squares. This is like a big bowl of heartbreaking foreshadowing. It's a premonition to the actual Animaniacs show, which does take over the Tiny Toon slot a year later. It's like Babs Bunny totally taught them about 90s humor, and a year later they wind up on my television set with painted noses. It's pretty cool, really. I was devastated when Tiny Toons went off the air. It's nice that that void was, however, filled with Animaniacs, which is another amazing, heartfelt show. It's also amazing how much the Animaniacs look like the reimagining of the classic tunes from the Tiny Toons show. Goopy Gear really looks like Yakko to me, but in particular, Roxy's likeness is identical to that of Dot, with the exception of the fact that her nose is of course a black and white nose, unlike Dot's red nose, and Dot has a distinctive flower in her hair, which is different from the ornament that you can see in Roxy's hair. Originally, Spielberg had pitched a Plucky Duck spin-off show to replace Tiny Toons, and although the show evolved from being a show about ducks to one about indistinctive fox monkeys that resemble the 1930s tunes, I find it really cool that Plucky still wound up in the theme song of the Two-Tone Town tunes as seen in Animaniacs. In that episode you can see Plucky painting himself black and white and saying it's amazing what you have to do to get work in this town, and later he can be seen in the theme song of those tunes. But it's sad that Plucky never really had a prominent role or was never really featured as a spin-off in Animaniacs. Having said that, there were lots of great Tiny Toon spin-offs in Animaniacs, including that one skit that totally featured Elmira. So that's my discussion of how the 1930s tunes, including Foxy, Roxy, Goopy Gears, and even Bosco and Honey, all played a part in the evolution that ultimately culminated in the creation of the Animaniacs. So even though the Animaniacs weren't created in the 1930s in another very real way, they were. And even though they're not these characters of Bosco and Honey and Goopy Gears, but in another very real way, they are. I also love how the Hippo characters are broadened and flushed out into these full characters of being endangered hippos who leave the jungle because they're so hip and they want to enjoy the trendy lifestyle of the city, and that kind of gives the explanation of why they're in the city in these 1930s cartoons in the first place. So that was really cool. But Animaniacs does have a slew of original characters that don't really have their origin in the 1930s. For instance, Pinky and the Brain, Rita and Runt, and Minerva Mink, who may be inspired off classic movie stars, but they were never really classic tunes, although they have that vibe and they totally have their place in the Animaniacs show. Minerva Mink was apparently originally conceived of by Paul Dini for Tiny Toons, but was never used, and eventually found her place on Animaniacs, which I'm grateful for because I love that character, and I really hope to see more of her and of the broader cast of Animaniacs in any upcoming Warner Brothers production. So leave me a comment, let me know what you think. Are these characters just Foxy and Roxy and Goopy Gears with their nose painted red and their humor updated to the 90s? Or are they totally new, fresh characters merely inspired off those tunes? Let me know what you think. Leave me a comment in the comments bar below. Thanks so much for watching my Animaniacs evolution discussion. Be sure to check out my other nerdy videos and subscribe for more upcoming nerdy fun. That's all, folks.